Thank you very much, Sebastian. We can start.
Well, welcome everyone. Very warm welcome wherever you are. I see a lot of names today, so Kathleen, you've attracted a great audience. It's a special pleasure to have Kathleen McVey speak to us. She's a great expert on Ephrem, and many of you will have her volume in the Classics of Western Spirituality and her translations of hymns on nativity and virginity. It was one of the first major books with translations of Ephrem, so we all owe Kathleen a great debt for her work. Kathleen is retired from Princeton Theological Seminary, where she was Professor of Valley Christianity, and I've only once visited the seminary, but what overwhelmed me was the wonderful library. But that's not our business today, but I always appreciate really good libraries. So Kathleen, would you like to start and introduce us to this fascinating topic of conception through the air, something that people will have noticed in medieval art, where a line of light pierces the Virgin's ear, but it all goes back a very long way to St. Ephrem and earlier. So, Kathleen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me to address this group. And thank you, all of you who are showing up today. I'm very flattered and a little intimidated. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And yes, I was tempted to start showing lots of pictures of 14th and 15th century European versions of conception by ear, but I thought, we'll just stick to this one hymn and see if I am able to persuade you of the interpretation I'm proposing of the hymn as a whole. But let me go to kind of an introduction, and then I'll read the hymn, and then we'll all talk. So Ephrem the Syrian is among the first to explore the idea of conceptio per aurem, conception by ear, a vivid encapsulation of the belief in Mary's virginal conception. It is literally the embodiment of the conviction that at the moment of the Annunciation, the infant Jesus was miraculously conceived in Mary's womb. As such, it invites representation in the visual arts. It is no surprise then that Ephrem, with his frequent use of visual imagery and his concern to defend and celebrate Mary's virginity, that he would find this motif attractive. His corpus includes only a few instances, but these significantly influenced later Syriac Mariology. So much so that it was once thought to be a unique feature of Syriac tradition. It's now clear that this motif is not uniquely Syriac, nor is Ephrem the first to elaborate on it. Hildegrave identified Greek and Latin antecedents to Ephrem, and Nicholas Kostas has studied later elaborations, especially in the works of Proclus and his school. Yet Ephrem remains one of the earliest to employ the motif in a complex and imaginative manner. So for such exploration, and that is hymn 35 on the church. The hymn is challenging to the interpreter. Ephrem seems to jump unpredictably from one subject to another without clearly connecting his thoughts. By engaging the hymn through his general understanding of sense perception, I believe, its fundamental structure emerges. So before reading the hymn itself, I want to comment on its structure and the themes Ephrem develops in each of its 5 sections. The hymn consists of 23 strophes, each with 3 lines of 5 plus 5 syllables. The first and last are introduction and summation. The main body comprises 4 sets of 5 strophes, interrupted by a penultimate pair, and this is where the conception by ear is to be found. The first strophe presents Mary and Eve as 2 naive young girls who brought about stunningly different conditions for humankind. Ephrem proceeds to compare and contrast simplicity and cleverness, first with respect to Mary and Eve, then more generally. There must be, he thinks, a delicate balance between them. This is something that Eve got wrong, leading to death for humankind, while Mary got it right, leading to the restoration of life. Not content with simply asserting a need for balance between cleverness and simplicity, Ephrem adds a metaphor of taste, with salt representing the discernment that enabled Mary to achieve the necessary balance. Next, keeping the sense of taste in mind, with references to taste, to bitterness, and to seasoning, he introduces further polarities. To simplicity, he adds naivete, and to cleverness, he adds guile. Without abandoning these metaphors of tasting, Ephrem returns to the opposition of life and death, this time adding other layers: love versus sin, deceit versus trust. One of each of these pairs is clearly good, the other clearly bad. Using the language of kinship, however, he softens the moral polarities by moving from deceit versus trust to guile versus naivete. Finally, he turns to his metaphorical recipe for the proper mixture of cleverness and simplicity. Within a few lines, the opposing term for love is no longer sin, but lack of taste. The cumulative effect of these stanzas is to develop the complexity of Mary's character, as well as to entertain us with his literary prowess. Both the moral difference, love versus sin, and the theological consequence of their decisions, life versus death, are clear. Yet even Mary shares similar character traits, simplicity and naivete, as well as cleverness. When seasoned with the salt of discernment, Mary's cleverness, while removed from the bitterness of guile, has a provocative tang. So the need for balance between naivete and cleverness prepares us for an otherwise abrupt transition to the subject of the hands as agents of civilization and culture. This is the new metaphor that undergirds the second section of the hymn. Human hands symbolize human achievement and ultimately the mind. This sudden shift at first seems arbitrary, and it is certainly challenging to the interpreter. But Ephrem's general understanding of sense perception is the key, I think, to this shift, as well as to the hymn as a whole. He begins with the polarities already established, cleverness and simplicity. Metaphorically, naivete and guile, or cleverness and simplicity, resemble 2 hands, which have strength only when working together. Ephrem quickly moves to various forms of collaboration, best represented by the hands and fingers. When they work together, the hands are able to subdue the sea and the dry land by smelting and forging brass and iron, and by hewing mountains and filling in valleys. All these technological achievements are the work of human hands. Likewise, the daughters of the 2 hands, their fingers, despite apparent weakness, have in fact remarkable accomplishments. The first of the extraordinary abilities of the hands and their fingers is their capacity for adornment with jewelry. A more exalted allegorical ornamentation of the fingers is evident when they assist in artistic and intellectual pursuits, when drawing, painting, or sculpting images, or when writing books or facilitating numerical calculation, counting on the fingers, I think is the allusion. In the final lines of this strophe, Ephrem adds one more element to his praise for the arithmetical skills made easier by the fingers. The cupped hands, with only their naked fingers, represent the world and its numbers. This may be an allusion to Ephrem's idea that time and number are incorporeal entities that undergird the other incorporeals. In sum, since the fingers are useful for counting, they enable humans to think about numbers. Since number is one of two entities from which all the incorporeals branch out, the fingers enable humans to contemplate incorporeal realities. In the third part of the hymn, Ephrem introduces yet another level of metaphor. The hands, thanks to their ability to enhance the higher human capacities, are like their friend, companion, or kinsman, who is also a stranger and a foreigner, one who is both immersed in them and beyond them. Although Ephrem does not name this figure here, similar descriptions elsewhere in his corpus suggest that he is the human mind or capacity for transcendence. In his refutation of Manichaean views, for example, he describes mind as transcendent and not limited to a place, yet paradoxically fully present in the human body. Contrasting the great light of a bonfire in the desert with the excellent mind of a little human, he argues, every light that exists can be confined in an enclosure, but there is no enclosure to confine the mind, for it is confined in the body, but greater than it, and in the midst of creation, but much greater than it. It is in the enclosure of creation, but creation has no power against it, for it is without limit because its reach extends even to God, who is limitless. In the next verses of the hymn, Ephrem continues his portrayal of the human mind, or the capacity for transcendence, now adding the metaphor of a swooping bird. Soaring like a bird, this ineffable messenger flies without wings, while concealing within himself a mystery entrusted to him. Again, we can confirm the identification of this winged messenger as the mind by adducing passages where Ephrem explicitly applies the same imagery to the mind and its capacities. Come and fly to the Savior's side with the feathers of the mind and the wings of thought, and then cleanse and clarify the eyes of your intelligence and ascend to gaze upon the sun, from the Hymns on Faith. Consideration of the human capacity to count using the fingers led to reflection on the relation of the hands to the mind. The next step will be to consider more broadly the relation of these senses to the mind. Similarly, in his treatise against Bardaisen's Damnus, Ephrem moves from consideration of incorporeals to a detailed account of the working of sense perception. Ordinary bodily perception is dependent on the senses, which he counts as 7. Sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch are all clearly among them, and each has its proper organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and limbs. Each bodily sense must communicate with the mind for meaningful perception. For example, the tongue produces various sounds heard by the ear, but the meaning of these variations of the tongue and of sound is perceived by the mind. Likewise, even though an unlearned eye can see a book, it cannot understand it. In his prose works, especially those addressing Bardyson's and Mani's views, Ephrem sets out his views on the functioning of the senses in ordinary life and their relation to the working of the mind. His opinions, as Udaposical has shown, are consistent on many points of detail with the ideas of a variety of philosophers and physicians among his contemporaries. In this hymn, then, Ephrem may assume that his audience is familiar with his views on ordinary sense perception as set forth in his prose, or he may simply assume these ideas are shared by any educated audience in his time and place. For Ephrem, however, communicating spiritual meaning, which is his concern in this hymn, and more importantly, effecting spiritual transformation, are not simply matters of transmission of messages through ordinary sense perception. To make this point, he might have chosen to elaborate an idea of spiritual perception through a set of spiritual senses that mirror the physical senses as Origen did. At times, he seems to allude to this sort of solution. Here, however, in the following strophes, he chooses a different path. He repeatedly begins with a statement that seems to imply the usual forms of sense perception, mainly of hearing and seeing. He could also easily name the mysterious foreigner, who seems to be, as I've argued here, a metaphor for the mind or for some other transcendent faculty. Yet he does not do so. Instead, he seems intent upon destabilizing the ordinary understanding of perception. Even though the mind's activity is essential to the perception of meaning of any sort, perception of the hidden mysteries is not merely analogous to ordinary perception, not even to the perception of incorporeals. It is sui generis. To make this point, he now startles us with inconsistencies, forcing us to recognize that we are entering a different realm where the usual rules about perception do not apply. In strophes 14 and 15, Ephrem asserts that the ear is not meant to hear the voice of this mysterious stranger when he speaks the language of silence, a language the ear is unable to comprehend. As the voice is foreign to the eye, so also is silence foreign to the ear. In other contexts of ordinary life, the senses may assist one another. The mouth may substitute for the inexperienced eye by tasting the fruit that looks good but is bitter. The heart may test the words that may beguile an inexperienced ear. Further, he claims that it may seem as if one organ of sense perception does the work of another. When there is no sound for the ear to hear, the eye, by seeing a gesture, conveys to the mind the meaning that ordinarily hearing would convey. Or in order to prove that it is the mind rather than any of the senses that perceives meaning, he observes that if the speakers, quote, are Persians, the mind fails to perceive the meaning of the words, though the ear did not fail to perceive the sound. These are all subtle arguments taken from elsewhere, not from this hymn, about exceptional cases in the everyday operation of the senses. But in this third section of hymn 35, Ephrem introduces notions of mystery and silence, and meanings that neither are the senses able to perceive, nor is the mind able to comprehend. Rather than invoking concepts of a spiritual ear that hears these mysteries and a spiritual eye that sees them, here he confounds his audience by mixing the senses. And here we're back to the hymn. The eye may hear the silent voice that the ear is unable to hear. We might call this a sort of spiritual synesthesia. In the fourth section, strophes 17 and 18, where we find the conception by ear, Ephrem reintroduces Eve and Mary after their prolonged absence. In 4 of the intervening verses, he considered naivete and cleverness, and in 10 more, he pondered sense perception and the mind, focusing especially on the hands and the tactile sense, but culminating in confusion in and for the eyes and ears. Despite human capacities and accomplishments, and despite the human mind's ability to interpret the information provided by the senses, spiritual discernment eludes us. Ephrem's return to the foremothers of sin and redemption brings the discussion of the senses and sense perception into the drama of sin and redemption. First, he shows that in Eve, ordinary sense perception is confounded in the face of spiritual choices. Then he shows that is resolved by Mary's conception by ear, a sudden dramatic assertion of the fact of incarnation. Now, how does this work? In the normal process of seeing corporeal things, the object of sight is portrayed in the mind. And again, I'm going to other works of Ephrem. Before a painter begins to paint, the likeness of what he will paint, whether it be, he says, a horse or an eagle or a lion, is painted in his mind. Similarly, verbal description may create a picture in the mind of a reader or listener, as Ephrem implies in his 15th hymn on Paradise. After rehearsing details about Balaam's ass, the serpent, and Judas gleaned from scripture, and commenting on their significance, he remarks that these and similar things, and all I had read, portrayed the garden of life in my mind. In the 17th strophe of the present hymn, however, Eve's case is different. She sees one thing, but another is portrayed in her mind. She has been deceived and she will regret it. We are told that Eve saw, apparently with her eye, the beauty of the tree, but instead of portraying what she had seen, Eve's mind portrayed the deceitful advice that she had heard. This is not, as in the case where the eye understands the meaning of a gesture because the ear cannot hear it. Eve saw the beauty of a visible corporeal thing, the tree, but the deceitful advice that she heard supplanted the image of the tree in her mind. In strophe 18, the inversion of sense perception that takes place in Mary's case is a complex mirror image of Eve's. With her eye, Eve saw the tree's beauty, but with her ear, Mary saw one who cannot be seen. The voice here alludes to Gabriel's words, but also hints at the Word who was conceived. Whereas the advice of the serpent mysteriously and disastrously appears in Eve's imagination where the tree ought to be, the power mysteriously and fortuitously appears in bodily form in Mary's womb. As the hidden one came in a voice, implausibly seen by Mary's ear, the word of God came in a body just as implausibly conceived in her womb. So here now is the conception by ear at the culmination of so many strophes describing and then subverting normal sense perception. We may well ask, along with death and Satan, what is the point of all this? The final section of the hymn constitutes a response to that challenge. In a rhetorical echo and theological expansion of Luke 2:13 and 14, the angels respond with an announcement that the one conceived brings life, goodness, joy, and hope. Death and Satan seek in vain to flee. For their destruction of life and hope, they are themselves annihilated. The utter defeat of the forces of hopelessness restores hope on earth and joy on high. The final strophe revisits human sense perception, portraying the joy of the senses at this victory and anticipating their greater satisfaction still to come. Simultaneously, Ephrem brings the hymn home to us, his listeners, longing for more after the joy at the announcement of the incarnation. Our senses are eager to have it all, but the poet encourages us to moderate this desire for fulfillment. So now, having broken down Ephrem's poetry into a prosaic explanation, we go back and read the poem itself in translation and see if these things that I have said resonate with what you're hearing in this case. So I will not read the headings that I inserted. I'll just read the poem. Two naïfs, two simple girls, Mary and Eve, placed in comparison. One the cause of our death, the other of our life. Praise to your wisdom. Eve, her cleverness withdrew from her simplicity. She became indiscreet. Mary, by her discernment, made her cleverness the salt of her simplicity. Neither does a word of naivete have taste without cleverness, nor does a word of deceit have trust without simplicity. Love is akin to all naivete. Sin is neighbor to all guile. But one is able by the other to be adorned, my brothers. Naivete tempers the bitterness of guile. Cleverness seasons the word of simplicity. Cleverness is naive. Simplicity is clever. For when they are not combined, they are repugnant, each on its own. The one is without taste, the other without love. But when they are mixed as one, together they become great. They resemble, allegorically, the two hands, since when they are far from one another, they are weak. But when they work together, they can dominate the world. For they subdue the sea, and they subdue the dry land. Brass they have melted and poured. Iron they have softened and forged. Valleys they have filled and raised up. Mountains they have hewn and brought low. Two mothers who possess daughters, 10 fingers. With these weak daughters, they subdue formidable things. Though their power is weak, their accomplishment is splendid. They are small, but great when gems are multiplied. Ordinary, but beautiful when they paint images. Silent, but articulate when they write books. They are naked, but clad in the numbers of calculations, empty cupped palms, whose fullness alone becomes by calculation the world and its numbers. A single kinsman they have, a companion and one from the same stock, a friend and relative whose origin is difficult to understand, a foreigner and yet one entirely immersed in them. He is their messenger, flying without wings, turning without pinions, and soaring without feathers. He hides in his bosom the mystery entrusted to him. He murmurs lest his voice reach the sense of hearing, because it is not for the ear that he speaks in his stillness. To the eye alone, he reveals the hidden mysteries. And that's a verse we may want to talk about. The ear is not accustomed to his language, for it is barbarian to his language of stillness. Only one shares his mother tongue, the silence that is akin to him. Just as the voice is foreign to the pupils of the eye, so also the ear is foreign to the silence of everything. Her vision hears, its error listens. With the eye, Eve saw the beauty of the tree, but the advice of the deceiver was painted in her imagination, and regret was the result of the deed. With her ear, Mary saw the hidden one who came in a voice. Conceived in her womb was the power who came in a body. Death and Satan asked, what was the value of this? Standing there, the watchers heard and shouted out for joy about him. He is the killer of death. He is the destroyer of evil. He is the joy of those on high and the hope of those below. Death and Satan looked at one another and trembled. They took counsel. Where shall we flee and hide? To the desert the evil one fled. Into the depths death descended. But to the dwellings where they had fled from him, he entered. To the desert he went out to conquer the evil one in his land. Into the depth he descended to conquer death in his den. Since the two eradicators of human hope were annihilated, hope increased on earth and joy on high when the watchers brought good tidings to those below. Since we were filled with the joy our senses eagerly desired, they panted after the surplus, the rest of the overabundance. Let us hold back our hunger to enjoy it another day. So I think I will let go there, since there are so many of you here. And since I know not only Sebastian Brock, who might have things to say about the luminous eye and all the things I didn't get into in the following two hymns that are certainly related in many ways to this hymn. And also I see Susan Harvey, who has said a lot about the senses in Ephrem and elsewhere. And so, and many of you I don't know, but I'm sure you have good things to talk about too. So I'm going to leave it there. So.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen, for a wonderful exposition of this highly dense poem. Until you brought it to my attention again, I had forgotten how difficult it was. You have provided a most illuminating reading of it. And I've translated the next two hymns, which are far easier. You see, I took the lazy path, whereas you've taken the really difficult one. I'm sure there are questions and queries. So it's open to everyone. So who would like to start off? Thank you very much for that comment. Yes, I think Ephrem has a lot of wisdom which can be recycled today. So I think our time is just about up. So Kathleen, thank you immensely for such a wonderful interpretation. Even if one or two things remain uncertain, you've cast a huge amount of light on it, and I really appreciate it. And we're so grateful to you. So may you explore many more of these wonderful Mimre and Madrashi of Ephrem, and I hope again sometime in the future will be willing to introduce yet another. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for listening. And our next meeting is, I think, the 10th of August, is that right? 10th of August.
Yes.
And it's Reverend Professor John Bear from Aberdeen. He is a most stimulating speaker, so I do recommend. I don't quite know what his topic is, but it will always be interesting. So thank you very much.
He will present his new book, Gregory of Nyssa.
Oh,
it will
very
be
good.
book launch. Yes.
Wonderful. Very
Human
good.
Image of God.
Good. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all. I appreciated this opportunity. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Well, we've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you, Kathleen.